The chandelier threw a warm lattice across the polished mahogany, and for a moment, the crystal stemware trembled in the light like it knew what was coming. Cinnamon and clove drifted from the kitchen, tangled with the faint pine of the 12-foot tree. My mother folded her napkin with deliberate grace. My father tapped the knife against his water glass, and Jason lifted his champagne as if he were blessing the house. His smile was careful, practiced, just wide enough to pass for kindness. Snow hushed the windows, pressing the entire town into a quiet I had always loved. Then my brother looked straight at me, tipped his glass higher, and said, "Pack your bags, Hazel. This house isn't yours anymore." The words didn't rise. They landed heavy as a lock clicking shut. Somewhere, a baseboard ticked in the heat, and the chandelier's light stopped feeling warm. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if a moment like this has ever turned your holiday inside out, hit the like button and subscribe. Someone else might need the strength in this story too. To understand why that sentence cuts so cleanly, you need to know what this house means, and how the people seated around that table learned to measure love in square footage and market value. I am Hazel, and I was raised by people who believed in repair. They sanded banisters until the oak ran like satin under your palm, and they lifted wallpaper in long, patient threads to rescue the roses beneath. My grandparents bought this Victorian when it was all draft and promise a place other people drove past without seeing. My grandfather's study smelled of leather and old paper, and his shelves were crowded with casebooks and a silver pocket watch wound each morning with ritual care. I learned to read law by the window where the north light never faded, and I learned that dignity doesn't require an audience. My parents, Thomas and Eleanor, spent their lives chasing airports and meetings with rooms that looked the same in Dallas and Dubai. They loved a good view and a better introduction. When work called, they answered, and when parenting complicated their itinerary, they found a way to extend the layover. My brother went with them private schools, ski photos from St. Moritz in frames that matched the hotel decor, a life arranged like a catalog page. I stayed. My grandparents formalized what had already become true. I was theirs to raise, and this house became the kind of steady you feel in your bones. If you want to find the fault line in a family, watch how they treat a place that won't move. When my grandparents died, first him, then her, like the body refusing to forget the heart, their will named me sole heir to the house and everything inside it. The language was clean, my grandfather's signature steady as a ruled line. At the reading, Jason whistled 2 notes of disbelief dressed up as charm. My mother pressed my hand, smiling a little too brightly, and my father stared at the ceiling like the crown molding had just become interesting. I told myself it was grief making everyone strange. Last Christmas, I invited them all back to restore a tradition. The house missed 1 long table candles down the middle, their flames bowing every time someone laughed. They arrived a day early, which should have told me what I needed to know. My parents' SUV idled in the circular drive, and Jason's coupe sat ringed with slush like a territorial line. Inside, papers lay fanned on the antique coffee table, my grandmother's table, until Jason slid them into a folder with that same careful smile. Their voices traveled in the old house way through vents along staircases beneath doors that never learned to seal completely. I heard the words home, gym floated over the library, where my grandfather had read me aloud the case that taught me what consideration means. I heard our space for weekends tossed into the 3rd-floor hallway that still remembers our summer hide-and-seek. The next morning, my father stood in the garden with a measuring tape, and when he caught me watching, he admired the dormant roses like a man who has just discovered winter. I tried to explain the house without defending it. I set coffee on the kitchen island, the way my grandmother used to do, white mugs, a small dish of sugar cubes, cream, cold as a stream in January. Sarah snapped photos of the dining room and sent them off with quick fingers. My mother opened architectural magazines to pages that brightened perfectly staged kitchens, and she made notes in a neat, controlled hand. Such a waste for one person, she said, studying the stove like it had failed an exam. I rinsed a bowl, let the water run, and kept my voice soft enough not to ring. I entertain, I said, more often than you think. She smiled, as if indulging a sweet idea. It's not the same as a real family filling these rooms. There are many ways to move someone out of their home. You can hire a truck and carry the boxes. Or you can gift them the boxes and pretend it's kindness. On Christmas morning, they handed me luggage with a built-in charger and a little booklet that promised stressless travel. For your next chapter, my father said, like a benediction. It's time you saw the world. My mother added, her head tilted the way she does when she'd like to be mistaken for tender. When I carried the luggage upstairs, I found a stack of cartons I had not bought neatly labeled in black marker Hazel's things. Someone had taken our hallway photographs, the ones of my grandparents flanked by climbing roses, and slid them into a desk drawer. On the table, where those frames had stood, a different arrangement smiled back at me. My parents, on a sailboat, Jason, at a corporate gala, Sarah, on a rooftop, with lights behind her, like confetti. By the time the turkey came out of the oven, my heartbeat had learned the tempo of a clock wound too tightly. I dressed in red formal, deliberate, and took the head of the table without apology. It was my grandfather's chair, and it had become mine the day the house recognized me as its keeper. Jason noted the choice like a referee. A flicker only then smoothed it away. Outside, fat flakes rounded the porch lights until they glowed like moons. Inside, utensil against china made a brittle soundtrack while we talked about weather and traffic and nothing that could pierce skin. Retirement isn't far off, my mother said, setting down her fork with ceremony. My father seemed to find courage in the glint of crystal. We've always loved this house, he said, like he spoke for a we that included me. Being here reminds us what a special place it is. My brother straightened businesslike, and the muscles in his jaw went steady. Let's be practical, he said. The preface that means someone is about to be unkind. This house is too big for one person. Mom and Dad can oversee renovations on the main floor. Sarah and I will take the upper levels as we start our family. You'll be happier in the city. Closer to work. I let the quiet spread the way water spreads over a surface that's been recently polished. And where I asked, do I fit into this plan? The question came out more even than I felt. He lifted his glass. The light caught the bubbles and turned them into something festive. Pack your bags, Hazel, he said. This house isn't yours anymore. Sometimes injustice is a shove. Sometimes it's polite. Jason kept his eyes on mine, and my parents each found a way to nod without looking like they were agreeing with theft. Sarah reached for her phone again, not in panic, but in the calm of a person updating a shared calendar. A kernel of cold opened at the base of my throat. Then training did what training always does. It lined facts up like dominoes and showed me the right one to touch. I had already seen the email drafted on Jason's laptop subject line, bright as a bruise, listing for historic Victorian spring market. I had already pressed the test alert on my security app and watched the little green dot settle on a map less than 10 minutes away. I had already set the deed, the will, and the trustee paperwork in a folder inside my purse. Each page notarized, each signature authenticated, each copy mirrored downstairs in the wall safe, and again in a digital vault that never sleeps. What I hadn't decided until this moment was whether I would let them keep believing I was the girl who kept the peace. I thought of my grandfather's pocket watch, the quiet insistence of its ticking. There is a right time. You'll know it when it comes. My father began to speak again, soothing and persuasive, listing reasons that sounded like favors. You're young, sweetheart. Travel. Live a little. We'll make sure you're more than fairly compensated. My mother added commute times and upkeep costs and how much the house would need in order to reach its potential. The library, she said almost regretfully, could be a lovely home gym. Jason tossed in a legal fiction about family property and redistribution, a phrase chewed to pulp by people who only care about fairness when they're behind. I slipped my hand to the side of my chair, feeling for the small weight of my phone in my purse. My fingers found the smooth rectangle, then the slightly raised edge of the panic icon on the app. I didn't press it. Not yet. I watched the way my mother's face softened when she thought she had almost won. I tracked the way my father avoided my eyes whenever the word ownership drew near, as if the molding had developed something to say again. I noticed the way Sarah folded her napkin perfectly in half, then in half again, and placed it at the precise center of her plate, a small declaration of order in a room that was about to lose it. Snow whispered against the panes. The candles bowed and righted themselves, their wicks steady, their margins of flame clear. In the hallway beyond the arch, the portraits kept their counsel. The house held still as houses do when they are waiting to learn who is listening closely enough to be trusted. I drew a breath and laid my palm flat on the table, the way my grandfather used to do when he was about to deliver a ruling. My voice was ready. My proof was ready. My courage was not loud, but it was complete. And as my mother opened her mouth to offer one last helpful reason, the front bell chimed once low and resonant, like the house itself had decided to answer for me. The bell's chime echoed through the hall, a single low note that felt older than all of us. Every head turned toward the foyer. My father's hand froze halfway to his glass, and Jason's confident smirk faltered just enough to show a hint of doubt. I stood, pushing my chair back slowly. The sound of the legs sliding over the wood seemed louder than it should have been. When I opened the front door, a rush of cold air swept in, carrying the faint scent of pine and snow. 4 uniformed security officers stepped onto the porch. Their breath clouded in the winter air as they introduced themselves with professional calm. I recognized the lead officer, Marcus, from the company I'd hired months ago. He gave me a small, steady nod, the kind people use when they know you've been waiting for this moment. Behind me, my family began speaking all at once. My mother's voice trembled with indignation, my father's with disbelief. Jason barked orders like a man who still thought he could steer the room. I didn't answer them. I stepped aside and let the officers in. The air inside changed as soon as they crossed the threshold. The warmth from the fire still glowed, but something invisible and final had shifted. Marcus's tone was polite but firm as he asked everyone to gather in the foyer. His words were simple requests for identification explanations about procedure, but the message was unmistakable. Control had moved quietly and completely. Jason refused first. He called it a family misunderstanding, accused me of overreacting, insisted there was no need for strangers to get involved. Marcus only listened, never raised his voice. When Jason was done, he turned to me. Ms. Miller, could we see the documents you mentioned? I walked to the table in the hallway, the one where my grandmother used to leave bowls of mints for guests, and laid out the folder I had prepared. The deed, the will, the trust papers, each one with the crisp scent of ink and legal weight. The embossed notary seals caught the light like coins at the bottom of a fountain. My father leaned in to read the top page, color draining from his face. My mother's hand found the back of his arm, gripping hard enough to leave marks. Jason stood apart, jaw tight, pretending indifference. Marcus studied the documents, then nodded to his team. Everything appears in order. Ms. Miller is the legal owner of this property. We'll need each guest to collect personal belongings and prepare to leave. My mother's composure cracked. Her voice, once a weapon polished by charm, broke around the edges. Hazel, this is Christmas. You can't mean this. I met her eyes, calm and steady. I didn't plan any of this, Mom. You did. Her face softened, searching for the daughter who used to fold first. When she found only silence, she turned away. Jason muttered something about lawsuits, but even he sounded uncertain. That's when the female officer, the one who had quietly stepped toward the study, called out, "Sir, what's this?" She held a manila envelope Jason had tried to conceal. Inside were forged papers, drafts of a property transfer with my name scribbled in a shaky imitation of my signature. There were printouts of real estate listings and a typed note about ownership redistribution. For a heartbeat, the house went completely still. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Marcus's expression didn't change, but his voice lowered. "Attempting to forge documents can be considered fraud, Mr. Johnson." Jason's confidence collapsed in a rush. "It was nothing official," he stammered. "Just ideas, notes for discussion." He couldn't look at me. Marcus turned back to me. "Would you like us to contact local law enforcement?" I hesitated. The part of me trained by years of courtroom precision said yes. But the part raised by two people who taught me compassion whispered no. "Not tonight," I said quietly. "But I'd like those logged as evidence." Marcus gave a slow nod. "Understood." The next half hour passed in uneasy silence. The officers waited by the door while my family packed what they could. I watched them move through the rooms like strangers, careful not to meet my eyes, avoiding the portraits that seemed to follow them. The rustle of suitcase zippers and the muffled sound of tears filled the halls that had once echoed with laughter. When they reached the door, my mother tried one last time. "Hazel, we're your family. You'll regret this." I looked past her toward the snow falling in thick white ribbons beyond the porch. "I already regret that it came to this," I said. "But I won't regret protecting what they built." My father's eyes flashed with anger he didn't bother to hide. "You'll be hearing from our lawyers. I look forward to it," I replied. My voice was even almost kind. It was the voice my grandfather used when delivering a verdict he knew was right. They left one by one. The headlights cut across the yard, then vanished down the long driveway. Jason was the last to go, standing just long enough to whisper, "This isn't over." I didn't answer. The door closed with a quiet click that sounded nothing like victory. After the security team confirmed the property was secure, Marcus handed me his card. "We'll patrol through the night, Ms. Miller. Call if you need anything." When they were gone, the silence returned, not peaceful this time, but vast. The table still held the remains of dinner, the gravy boat cooling beside half-filled glasses. A trail of wet footprints led from the foyer to the porch and stopped abruptly at the threshold, as if the house itself refused to follow them any farther. I turned off the music, then the lights, leaving only the fire to flicker against the walls. Sitting on the sofa, I felt the weight of everything settle: the years of trying to keep a fragile peace, the exhaustion of pretending family could not fracture like glass. Outside, snow fell heavier, burying the tire tracks, until even the evidence of their departure disappeared. The tree twinkled beside me, unaware that Christmas had ended hours too soon. The phone buzzed on the armrest. Vanessa's name glowed on the screen. "Everything okay?" I stared at the message for a moment before typing. "They're gone. I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. I walked through the rooms, slowly touching the things that remained exactly where they belonged. The framed photo of my grandparents on the staircase, landing the quilt my grandmother had sewn, the faint scent of her lavender polish still clinging to the banister. Every piece of the house felt like an exhale after holding its breath for too long. Yet beneath that relief was a hollow ache I hadn't expected. The house was mine, yes, but the cost had been steep. Family, even broken leaves, a silence nothing else quite fills. By morning, sunlight poured through the frost-glazed windows, turning the dining room into a cathedral of cold light. The plates from the night before still waited, and I washed them one by one. Each clink of porcelain in the sink sounded like punctuation to an argument finally ended. I spent the day restoring order, vacuuming the footprints from the rug, returning photos to their rightful places, locking the folder of documents in the safe. The act of cleaning steadied me. That evening, I built a fire again, not for warmth, but for company. The flames bent toward the air vent, dancing as if to a tune only they could hear. I poured a small glass of wine, the same kind my grandmother saved for holidays, and raised it toward the portrait of her and my grandfather above the mantel. "I kept it safe," I whispered. The fire popped softly in reply. But as night deepened, exhaustion crept in like fog through an open window. I closed the curtains, checked the locks, and made my way upstairs. The house moaned the way old wood does when it settles, but it no longer frightened me. It felt like breathing. When I reached my bedroom, I paused at the door. The folded luggage they had given me still sat where I'd left it, gleaming under the lamplight. I touched the handle, then opened the closet and slid it deep into the shadows. Let it stay there unused until it gathered dust. Before turning off the lamp, I looked once more around the room. Everything was still too still. I should have felt proud, but what rose instead was a quiet loneliness that pressed behind my ribs. I thought of my grandmother humming as she decorated the tree of my grandfather, whistling low while tightening a loose hinge. For the first time since law school, I missed the sound of another heartbeat in this house. The snow kept falling. By midnight, it had covered the porch steps completely. I watched through the window as flakes drifted under the light like pieces of ash, and the cold outside met the warmth on the glass, leaving faint halos of condensation. I told myself I would sleep, but instead I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the faint tick of the old pocket watch on the nightstand. Its rhythm was steady, familiar grounding. Somewhere in that quiet, the adrenaline faded, and what remained was something closer to grief. Not for the loss of people who had tried to steal from me, but for the simple truth that I had hoped against reason they might someday change. When dawn finally came pale and hesitant, I felt emptied out. But beneath that emptiness was a thin seam of resolve. The house was still standing. I was still standing. The phone vibrated again. Another message from Vanessa. "Do you want company today?" I looked around the silent room, the soft light spilling over the old wallpaper, the faint hum of the heater below. For the first time since the confrontation, I felt something close to yes. Outside, the snow had begun to slow, leaving behind a world reshaped by the night. The tracks were gone, the lawn smooth and untouched. The house looked new again, though everything inside carried the weight of what had been defended. I set the phone down, stood by the window, and let the morning light touch my face. There was still a tremor inside me, a hollow place where certainty used to be, but also a quiet promise. Whatever came next, I wouldn't face it alone. Downstairs, the fire waited to be lit again. The house, faithful and patient, seemed to breathe with me. Vanessa arrived just before noon, the wheels of her car crunching over the frozen gravel. From the kitchen window, I saw her step out bundled in her gray coat, carrying 2 paper bags, and that determined calm she always brought into any storm. I opened the door before she could knock. The scent of coffee and takeout mingled with the crisp winter air as she handed me the bags. "I didn't think you'd cook," she said, her tone light but careful. She moved through the house as if she'd been here her whole life, setting containers on the counter, glancing at the half-burned candles still left on the dining table from Christmas night. The silence between us wasn't heavy, It was the kind that follows when words feel too small. Diana came later, her arrival announced by laughter before she even stepped inside. She carried a bouquet of mixed winter greens wrapped in paper, their sharp scent cutting through the dullness of the air. "You could use some color in here," she said, placing them in a tall glass vase. I hadn't realized how gray the house had felt until that moment. We ate sitting on the living room floor, Chinese food cartons spread across the coffee table. The fire crackled low, the only sound besides the occasional clink of chopsticks and the faint hum of the wind outside. I told them everything from the early arrival, to the hidden envelope, to the moment I called security. Vanessa listened with her lawyer's precision, but her eyes stayed soft. Diana reacted like a friend who felt every slight, personally shaking her head when I reached the part about the luggage. When I finished, the house was quiet again, except for the snow slipping from the roof in slow, heavy thuds. Vanessa poured wine and held out my glass until I met her eyes. "You did exactly what you needed to," she said. "Legally, morally, every way that matters." Diana nodded. Family or not, that wasn't love. That was greed wearing a familiar face. I wanted to agree, but the words caught in my throat. The idea of my own family plotting against me still felt unreal, like a bad dream that left fingerprints. I looked toward the stairs where the shadows deepened along the banister, my grandfather once polished by hand. "They're still my family," I said quietly. "And I keep thinking there must have been another way." Vanessa didn't argue. She only reached out and rested her hand on mine. "Sometimes the only way through is the one that cost you something," she said. That night, they refused to leave. They opened the sofa bed, brought pillows from the guest room, and declared it a slumber party for the newly liberated. The phrase made me laugh in spite of myself. For the first time in days, I slept without waking at every creak. The morning light spilled across the floor in pale ribbons. The world outside looked untouched, the storm erased beneath a white calm. Vanessa was already dressed, phone in hand, scanning through messages. "I've been watching for any filings," she said without looking up. "Nothing yet, but I expect a move soon." She was right. By midweek, the messages started calls. I didn't answer emails that sounded rehearsed, each one circling the same point: reconciliation through compromise. Jason's came last, the words clipped and strategic. "This doesn't have to get ugly," he wrote. "We can settle quietly." Vanessa read over my shoulder, then looked at me. "They're probing for weakness. Ignore it for now, but save everything." I did. Each message went into a folder marked evidence. I stopped checking my phone after dinner. The sound of new mail had started to feel like an alarm. 3 days later, the certified letter arrived, a thick envelope from a law firm in Boston, the kind known for marble lobbies and six-figure retainers. The letter was polite, almost apologetic, suggesting that my grandparents might not have been of sound mind when drafting their will. My hands shook as I read it aloud. Vanessa took the pages, scanned them once, and gave a small, humorless laugh. "Desperation dressed in legal stationery," she said. "They have no ground to stand on." Still, the words left a mark. I spent that evening rereading my grandfather's will, tracing his signature with my fingertip. The ink was dark, the loops precise. I remembered the steadiness of his hand when he'd helped me with my first legal draft years ago. He had always been clear about property, about fairness, about love. The challenge against his judgment felt like an insult to everything he'd been. 2 mornings later, the doorbell rang again. Through the frosted glass, I saw an elderly man in a dark overcoat standing beside a briefcase. His posture was straight, his expression kind. "Miss Miller," he said when I opened the door. "My name is William Hargrove. I was a colleague and friend of your grandfather's." He stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders, eyes moving across the room with quiet recognition. "He told me you'd likely need this someday," he said, opening his briefcase. "I'm sorry it had to be now." He laid out several folders on the table. One held notarized statements, another a video log from the day my grandfather's will was signed. There were medical reports confirming his soundness of mind and witness affidavits from 2 retired judges. Each page carried the weight of foresight. My grandfather had seen this coming. William handed me a sealed envelope yellowed at the edges. "He asked that you read this only if the house was ever challenged." The handwriting on the front stopped me. It was the same elegant script that had signed my birthday cards as a child. I opened it carefully, the paper soft from years of storage. "My dearest Hazel," it began. "If you're reading this, then I trust the moment has come when you must stand firm. This house is yours, without condition, not for sentiment, but for stewardship. Others may see walls and property. You see memory, history, and purpose. Never doubt your right to protect what was entrusted to you." The letter ended with a single line that made my throat tighten. "You carry our integrity forward, even when it feels like standing alone." I read it twice before setting it down. William waited quietly, his hands folded. "He was proud of you," he said softly. "He wanted to be sure you'd have every safeguard." The rest of the afternoon passed in slow conversation. William told me stories about my grandfather's early days in court, his stubborn insistence on doing what was right even when it cost him friends. When he left, the house didn't feel so empty anymore. That evening, I called Vanessa. "He planned for this," I told her. "Every detail." "Then we'll use it," she said. They can't argue against a man who prepared for every possibility. The following week brought another wave of noise, more letters, each weaker than the last. Jason's attorneys tried citing obscure inheritance statutes, claiming verbal promises that never existed. Vanessa dismantled each claim with the precision of someone carving glass. Then came the strangest blow, a call from the local historical society. The director's voice carried the same careful concern I'd heard too often from clients about to deliver bad news. "We received notice that you've filed for renovation permits to convert your property into condominiums," she said. I felt my stomach drop. "I filed no such thing," I answered. It took less than a day to uncover the truth. Jason had impersonated me using falsified emails to send proposals that would have compromised the home's historical designation. The discovery turned the tide completely. His lawyers withdrew within a week, leaving him exposed to charges of fraud. When Vanessa brought the signed withdrawal papers to my office, she placed them on the desk without ceremony. "It's over," she said. "They're backing down." I looked at the papers, then at her. Relief didn't come all at once. It moved slowly like sunlight reaching through clouds. "So, that's it." "For now," she said, smiling gently. "They might try to apologize next." They did. My mother's messages shifted from accusation to remorse. My father's tone softened, though pride kept him from saying the word sorry. Jason stayed silent, but Sarah wrote an email weeks later, short, hesitant. She said she regretted the way things unfolded, that watching the fallout had changed how she saw everything. I believed her cautiously. By late winter, the legal files were boxed and labeled, stored neatly in the study. The snow began to melt from the roof and the gutters sang with meltwater. I spent my evenings walking the perimeter of the property, listening to the house settle, feeling the steadiness return. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the Historical Society. Not a complaint this time, but an invitation. They wanted to feature the house in their spring tour. A model of preservation, the director called it. I stood on the porch, reading those words while the sun dipped behind the trees, gold light threading through the bare branches. The quiet felt different now, not lonely, but certain. Inside, the clock on the mantel chimed 6 times. I thought of my grandparents, how they'd trusted me with something far larger than property. They'd trusted me to remember who they were. The air in the house was warm again, faintly scented with the polish I'd used that morning. As the last of the snow melted off the garden stones, I knew the fight was done. But peace is a fragile thing, and rebuilding it would take more than legal victories. Still, as the light faded across the parlor floor, I felt ready to try. March arrived quietly, wrapped in soft rain that made the garden smell like the beginning of something new. The snow was gone, the ground slick and dark, and the crocuses my grandmother planted decades ago had started to push through. I stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, watching the buds tremble under a light wind. It struck me that they bloomed whether anyone deserved them or not. That same afternoon, I received a message from my mother. It was short, tentative, asking if she and my father could stop by. Vanessa thought I should consider it. "You've already won," she said gently. "Maybe it's time to see what peace looks like." I wasn't sure peace and my parents could exist in the same room, but I agreed to one visit supervised short and without Jason. When they arrived a week later, I felt my chest tighten. My father stepped out first, his posture still as formal as ever, but slower now. My mother followed, wrapped in a pale blue coat I remembered from years ago. They paused at the gate, almost as if asking the house for permission. Inside, I had set out tea and simple pastries. The living room looked different now, lighter, somehow less burdened. My mother walked in and stopped at the fireplace, her eyes scanning the familiar furniture. "The house looks wonderful," she said, her voice soft, cautious. "Your grandmother would approve." "That matters to me," I replied. The words came out steadier than I expected. We sat for a while, letting small talk carry us through the first few minutes. My father complimented the preservation work I'd done, asked practical questions about the tours and maintenance. But beneath his measured tone was something quieter remorse, or at least the shape of it. He cleared his throat. "We shouldn't have pushed the way we did. It was wrong to try to change things." His eyes stayed fixed on the teacup in his hands. I nodded. "I appreciate that." My mother looked at him, then at me, searching for some cue that it was safe to relax. "I hope one day you'll forgive us," she said. "Families lose themselves chasing what doesn't matter." I think we did. I didn't promise forgiveness, but I didn't close the door either. We stayed like that for an hour, awkward but peaceful, each of us trying to find footing on ground we had nearly destroyed. When they left, my mother hugged me for the first time in years. It was brief, uncertain, but it didn't feel false. After they drove away, the house exhaled a long breath. I stood at the door until their car disappeared down the road, then turned toward the garden. The crocuses had opened fully purple and white against the dark soil. For the first time, I thought maybe the house could hold healing as well as memory. Weeks turned into months. Jason remained silent, but Sarah reached out again this time, with warmth that felt unpracticed but real. She came to town for a friend's wedding and asked to stop by. I almost said no, but something in her message, the line about wanting to apologize in person, made me agree. She arrived in early May alone. The garden was in bloom, and she stood among the roses my grandmother had tended her hand brushing a leaf as she looked around. "I used to think this house was just a symbol," she said. "Something everyone wanted a piece of. But it's more than that, isn't it?" "It's history," I said quietly. "It remembers who took care of it." She nodded, eyes glistening. I argued with Jason about what he was doing. Not loudly enough, I know. I went along because it seemed easier than standing against him. Her voice broke slightly. I'm sorry for my part in all of it. There was nothing performative in her tone, no trace of self-defense. I believed her. Thank you, I said. That means something. We walked through the garden for a long time, past the lilacs and the weathered bench near the hedge. She told me Jason had taken a new job in Chicago, that he was trying to start over though, still angry. When she left, she asked if she could keep in touch. I agreed, not out of obligation, but because forgiveness, slow and conditional, felt like a healthier inheritance than resentment. By June, the house was alive again. The local historical society began hosting monthly tours of the ground floor. The first morning, I stood by the entrance as visitors stepped inside, their voices softening in reverence. They admired the curved staircase, the stained glass, the carved moldings my grandfather had restored by hand. Seeing their appreciation filled a space that had long felt empty. After the tours ended, I lingered in the garden. William Hargrove had joined that day, his cane tapping rhythmically against the path. Your grandparents would be proud, he said, pausing near the rose arch. They always believed preservation wasn't about holding on, it was about teaching others why something matters. I smiled. I think I understand that now. Later that summer, I met Jordan Reynolds again. He lived 3 houses down, a landscape architect I'd known by sight for years. He stopped by one afternoon, offering to help restore the overgrown section near the fence line. My parents' farm went through something similar, he said, as he trimmed back the ivy. Family and property don't always mix well, but you can grow something new in the ruins. His calmness settled into the rhythm of the place. We worked side by side for days, planting, pruning, talking about the history of the neighborhood. He had a quiet laugh, the kind that made even silence feel companionable. When the project was done, he lingered by the gate. Would you let me treat you to dinner? He asked. It wasn't the question I expected, but it felt natural. We began seeing each other more often, simple dinners, walks through the old downtown streets, evenings in the garden, when the fireflies turned the yard into a small constellation. Jordan's understanding came without explanation. He never asked about the confrontation. He only listened when I chose to share. By late summer, the 3rd floor of the house had become an archive. Volunteers helped me organize boxes of letters, photographs, and architectural drawings into a small research space. Sometimes I'd find visitors lingering there longer than expected, lost in the stillness. I understood that too, the peace of touching history that refused to fade. Vanessa visited often, sometimes with new legal clients who needed advice about family estates or old homes. She joked that I was becoming an expert in both law and survival. We'd sit on the porch at dusk, wine glasses in hand, and watch the lights in town flicker on. You turned a wound into a foundation, she said once. Most people never get that far. The compliment stayed with me. It wasn't triumph I felt, but something quieter, stability, maybe even gratitude. I had fought for this house, yes, but it had also fought for me, teaching me what boundaries could hold and what they could let in. In early autumn, my parents asked to visit again. This time, I said yes, without hesitation. They came on a cool Sunday morning, bringing apple pie and a tentative warmth that felt genuine. My mother spent half an hour admiring the garden, my father asking about the preservation grants I'd applied for. We didn't talk about the past directly, but its sharp edges had softened. Before leaving, my father placed his hand on my shoulder. You've done good work here, he said. It's right that it's yours. It wasn't quite forgiveness, but it was enough. That night, after they'd gone, I sat in the study, surrounded by the quiet hum of the house. The clock on the mantel marked each second, with steady grace. I looked at the photographs of my grandparents, young proud, standing on the porch when the house was first restored. "You were right to trust me," I whispered. The wind outside stirred the chimes on the porch, a soft reply against the glass. The house no longer felt heavy with loss. It felt alive, like it had accepted this new chapter. Later, as I locked up for the night, I passed the hallway where Jason's voice had once declared that the house wasn't mine. The space felt different now, lighter reclaimed. I touched the wall where the light from the window spilled in, and it struck me how far peace can travel when you stop chasing validation. Downstairs, Jordan's laughter carried faintly from the porch as he waited to walk me to dinner. I turned off the last light and let the house rest behind me, its windows glowing softly in the evening. The future still held unknowns, but the fear that had once shadowed every step was gone. What remained was something stronger, a quiet certainty that what had been broken could be rebuilt, not the same, but whole in its own way. Autumn settled into the valley with a gentleness that only comes after a storm. The trees along the ridge had turned to copper and rust, and the air carried that faint sweetness of wood smoke and apples. Mornings came slower now, gold light filtering through the lace curtains and stretching across the old oak floors. The house had grown quiet again, but not the kind of quiet that bruised. It was a peaceful kind, the kind that hummed softly under every footstep. I woke early most days, long before the tours or meetings began, and walked the garden with a mug of coffee. The roses Jordan and I planted in the spring had taken hold, curling around the trellis in soft blush petals. The soil was cool beneath my hands, the kind of damp that spoke of endurance. I found myself talking to my grandparents sometimes, not out loud, just in thought. Every corner of this place still carried their presence, the faint scent of lemon oil in the banister, the way the light slanted through the stained glass at noon. One morning, while pruning the last blooms before the frost, Jordan came through the gate, carrying 2 cups from the cafe down the road. His hands were pink from the chill, and he grinned the way he always did when he caught me mid-work. "You never stop," he said, handing me one. I smiled. "Old habits. This garden raised me." He brushed a few fallen petals from my shoulder. "It's raising you still." We stood quietly, the steam from our cups rising between us. It wasn't a grand moment, just a still one, the kind that feels like home. The ease between us had deepened over the months, settling into something calm and certain. He understood what it meant to rebuild without asking to be part of the process too soon. That patience was its own kind of love. By November, the house had found a rhythm again. The Historical Society tours had grown into a monthly event, and local students came on weekends to learn about restoration work. The third-floor archive was now complete, its shelves lined with labeled boxes, family records, and architectural sketches dating back to 1897. I'd watch visitors climb the staircase with reverence, their eyes tracing the carved railings my grandfather once polished. Some would pause at the study door, as if feeling the weight of its history before stepping inside. Vanessa stopped by one afternoon after finishing a deposition. She brought a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, her expression softer than I'd seen in years. "I drove past your parents' house," she said as we sat on the porch. "Your mother's in the garden again. Looked like peace." "She's trying," I said. "We all are in our own ways." Vanessa tilted her head, studying me. "You look different too." "Lighter?" I asked with a small smile. "Resolved," she said. "You've built something steady here, Hazel. It's not just a house anymore. It's your proof that you don't have to inherit the chaos you came from." Her words stayed with me. That night, after she left, I sat by the window in my grandfather's study and watched the last leaves fall in the yard. The moonlight reached across the desk, catching the silver of his old pocket watch. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was guarding something fragile. I was simply living in it. A few days later, my father called. His voice was quieter now, stripped of its usual authority. "Your mother's making her apple pie," he said. "We wondered if you might join us for Thanksgiving this year." I hesitated, then asked, "Will Jason be there?" He paused before answering. "He's staying in Chicago. He says it's better that way for now." I thought about the boy who once showed me how to ride a bike, the man who later tried to take my home, and the silence that stretched between those versions of him. "Tell him I hope he finds some peace," I said. "And yes, I'll come." Thanksgiving was simple, just the three of us, with quiet conversation and the soft clatter of dishes filling the pauses. My mother served her pie warm, and my father made a toast about gratitude without looking at his notes. When I left that evening, my mother hugged me again longer this time. "We can't undo what we did," she whispered, "but we can remember who we used to be." Driving back through the cold, I felt something shift, not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Sometimes that was enough. Winter returned early, frosting the windows in delicate lace. The tours paused for the season, but I kept the house busy with small gatherings, friends, neighbors, even a few of the volunteers who had helped organize the archive. We'd light the fire, pour coffee, and share stories that wove laughter through the old walls. The sound reminded me that this house, for all its stillness, had room for joy again. One evening, Jordan arrived carrying a box wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "A late Christmas gift," he said, placing it on the coffee table. Inside was a framed sketch, a pencil drawing of the house, the garden in full bloom, and the two of us standing near the roses. Beneath it, he'd written a single line, "Some homes choose their keepers." The words caught in my throat. I looked at him, and in the flicker of the firelight, the last of my old defenses faded. "I think this one chose well," I said softly. He smiled, and that quiet, certain peace settled again between us. By spring, the garden was alive with color. Volunteers planted new heirloom varieties, and the local paper ran a feature on the restoration project. They called it "The House That Stayed." The title felt right. William Hargrove came by for the reopening event, leaning heavier on his cane, but still sharp as ever. "Your grandparents would have loved this," he said, surveying the crowd of visitors scattered across the lawn. "You've turned memory into movement." I thanked him, but words felt too small. As the afternoon faded into evening, I wandered back inside. The golden light stretched through the hallways, catching on the edges of picture frames. My grandparents' portrait hung above the mantel, now freshly cleaned, their smiles faint but enduring. I lit a single candle beneath it, the way my grandmother used to when she wanted to feel close to him after he passed. The flames swayed gently, casting the room in a quiet glow. I thought about everything that had happened, the betrayal, the confrontation, the long nights of doubt, and how strangely far away it all felt now. The anger had dissolved, leaving behind something steadier: respect for what was learned, gratitude for what remained. The house no longer needed guarding. It had become a place of welcome again, not a battleground. And I had become more than the person who defended it. I was someone who had learned how to stay. Later that night, as the last guests left and Jordan helped me gather chairs from the porch, I stepped out to watch the sky. The air smelled of rain, and a soft wind rustled through the trees. The house behind us glowed in the dusk, windows lit like warm hearts. I leaned against the railing, closing my eyes for a moment. The wind moved through my hair, and the sound of the garden at night, the low hum of crickets, the distant bark of a dog, felt like the world settling into balance. Some wounds, I realize, don't heal by forgetting. They heal when we stop feeding the anger that keeps them open. What's left is softer, truer, a kind of peace that asks nothing but to be kept. I turned back toward the house, its familiar outline framed against the fading sky. For the first time in years, I felt completely at home, not just within its walls, but within myself. If this story found its way to you, tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to know how far peace can travel. And if you believe, like I do, that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just stays. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for spending this time with me. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you find your own quiet place to belong.